Policy Magazine. Tonight's panel is a spin-off from the Paris Peace Forum, which the French government hosted on Armistice Day. And tonight our mission is to figure out, or at least shed some light on some very big, very important questions on the theme you see above you. Now I have to start by confessing a failure. I normally like to begin events like this with a joke. And I have to say I spent several days struggling to come up with a joke on the theme of how to reform multilateralism to support peace, and I failed utterly. If any of you have any suggestions in the course of events, feel free to share. But nonetheless, or perhaps it's because the subject is so important, and our mission tonight is a big one. Especially because, as you all know, this is an extraordinary moment in global politics, and extraordinary is a very polite word for what's actually going on. Multilateral organizations seem to be faltering. Strongman rulers are rising around the globe. The United States is withdrawing and retreating from its international engagements. The country is now led by a president who is openly scornful of international norms and institutions. Meanwhile, the US and China are locked in a trade war. The EU is locked in Brexit negotiations and an ugly budget battle with Italy. NATO faces a hostile Putin on one side and a hostile Trump on the other. And emerging powers like China and India are demanding changes to international organizations that undergird multilateralism, bodies like the UN and the World Bank, which, to be fair to India and China, don't really reflect these countries' new size and power and prestige. The problem is that all of this is happening as a long list of global problems, from cybersecurity to climate change and on, keep getting worse. So it's a scary moment, and the stakes for a discussion like this couldn't be higher. But we're not here tonight to wring our hands. The point of this conversation is to try and figure out what we can all do about it. And on that note, we're very lucky to have three super smart experts up here to help us do all that. Starting from my immediate left, we have Victoria Newland, who is Chief Executive Officer of the Center for New American Security. She's also a professor at Yale. She spent 32 years in government, is that right?
Yes.
During which, that's right.
Yes, I started when I was 10, thanks.
During which she served as State Department spokesperson under Hillary Clinton, and then as Assistant Secretary of State for European and Eurasian Affairs. To her left is our host tonight, Ambassador Gérard Araud, who has been France's man in Washington since September 2014. He's also a career diplomat and has held a long list of other impressive jobs, many of them relating to security in the Middle East. He was France's ambassador to Israel. He was also permanent representative to the United Nations. And to his left, your right, is Stuart Patrick, who is director of the International Institutions and Global Governance Program at the Council on Foreign Relations. He's also a State Department veteran, and he is the author of several books, including most recently the very, very good Sovereignty Wars, Reconciling America with the World, which you should all, I was going to say you should all read. You should all buy the book. It's much less important to Stuart that you actually do read it. Let me start with some questions for the group, and then we're going to open things up to the floor. So the premise for tonight, as we've already established, is that multilateralism is essential for peace. But just to be fair, we probably shouldn't assume that. I mean, I can probably guess what each of you thinks on the subject, but I do want to start by asking each of you, do you agree with this fundamental idea that multilateralism is essential for peace and that you can't have the latter without the former? Tori, you want to start?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know any country on the planet that can make peace alone except inside its own domestic situation, and even then that's sometimes hard. So if by multilateralism you mean it takes more than one country to settle disputes across borders, of course, of course.
But just two would be bilateralism, right? Not multilateralism, which implies broader international cooperation.
And it's also very rare for two countries who are locked in conflict to be able to settle it by themselves. Often they need a community outside, or honest brokers, or international organizations. So is it absolutely death-defyingly impossible to make peace without a multilateral environment? No, but is it far preferable, and is it far more likely to happen in a multilateral context? Absolutely.
Shihad, do you agree? I assume so, since this is your panel.
No, you know, the world, the international world, you know, the world is a jungle, in a sense that there is no judge, there is no gendarme if a crime is committed. So we need to try to civilize this jungle of sovereignties. And the multilateral organizations, in a sense, are trying to play this role. First, it's a sort of a marketplace where ideas are exchanged, where people can really pursue a dialogue, and it's healthy to have these sort of places. And secondly, they provide also mechanisms, you know, really maybe to avoid conflicts or to solve conflicts. So it's not a panacea, but it helps. I guess it helps to promote, defend, or re-establish peace.
I would say that multilateralism is certainly not a guarantee for peace, and it's not always essential. One can think of times where you have a balance of terror, say between the United States and the Soviet Union, and they didn't necessarily trade military blows. So you could have peace in other ways, but it wouldn't be a just peace necessarily, and it wouldn't be a durable peace, and it wouldn't be a legitimate peace. So when you think about that, I think we ignore international institutions at our peril. There's been a major trend in thinking about multilateralism to think, well, it could just happen with sort of a collection of great powers, for instance, deciding the world's fate. That's been tried, of course, historically. But when you think of mediating disputes that might be pending between two different countries, or much less trying to tamp down internal conflict, it's hard to imagine doing that unless you have standing international institutions that are at least part of the bulwark. The only other thing I would say is that when it comes to multilateralism, we've had experiences in the last 100 years with the League of Nations, with efforts at multilateralism that weren't really backed by power and weren't really backed by political will. And if you don't have those things, then you have to be careful just thinking that this is a technical exercise. If we just had the right institutions, everything would be fine. You still have to have the big powers actually get involved and use their suasion and their weight.
Point well taken. So we've agreed on, I think, the first major premise of the conversation tonight, but there's a second that we should discuss as well. When President Macron designed the Paris Peace Forum, or put his support behind it, the idea was that it would address what they have called, or he has called, a crisis of multilateralism. So the second question is, number one was, do we need multilateralism? Yes. The second is, does multilateralism indeed face a crisis? After all, I would urge you all to remember, the system, the global rules-based order, which is now about 70 plus years old, which emerged after World War II, and has been responsible for the creation of so much peace and prosperity, never worked quite as well as we sometimes like to pretend today, or as its defenders sometimes insist. And there were many moments over the last 70 years when it seemed to have broken down entirely, or at least frozen in stasis, whether it was during the Cold War, when at the UN, for example, the Security Council was almost permanently deadlocked between Russia and the United States, or in 1999, during the Kosovo crisis, when the United States and its new supposed friend, Russia under Boris Yeltsin, almost came to blows in the race to the Pristina airport, or during the Iraq War debate in 2003, when the United States couldn't get the support that it wanted and declared that Europe was divided and the whole world was divided between friends and enemies, and those who are with us and those who are against us. So there have been lots of crises in the multilateral order in the past. Is this one worse, and is this one special?
I mean, I think whether you want to call it a crisis or not, it's certainly special when a founding and foundational member of the two most important multilateral organizations, the UN and NATO, the United States, is calling into question whether either of those institutions is of particular value in solving global problems. So I think, if I had to guess, that's what prompted President Macron to try to rally the world. I do want to pick up on one thing Stuart said, though. He was equating multilateralism with the institutions, and I think there's a distinction in the sense that I think Gerard and I have both been involved in plenty of negotiations towards peace or to settle conflict that involved a constellation of nations, but not necessarily the institutions. It's always best if you get institutional support or if you use the tools of the institution, but it doesn't necessarily have to be the sine qua non for multilateral success, I would say.
I think if we have to look at multilateralism, we have to get rid of any naivete. Really, we have to be realistic, which means that the great powers are not going to really submit their vital interest to multilateralism. And that's the lessons learned from the League of Nations. That's the reason why there is the veto right in the Security Council. And actually, in a lot of conflicts, neither the US, nor China, nor Russia have accepted that the Security Council handle these conflicts. Iraq, but also the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. For the US, for Russia, you had Ukraine and Syria. For China, you had Myanmar and Sri Lanka, for instance. So power politics are here, they were here yesterday, and there will be tomorrow. We can regret it, but that's the real world. The second point is also that we have to be flexible, and I really agree with what Toria just said. Multilateralism, it's the institutions, but it's also a coalition of willings, and even we have to be more creative, going beyond the states. I think the COP21, which was organized in Paris, and the forum organized also in Paris on Veterans Day, really, today there are so many issues where we need to work beyond the states with the civil society, with the business community, the territories, the cities. And that's also, I guess, a new prospect for multilateralism.
Yeah, just to pick up on that, I agree with what's been said about the proliferation of sort of multilateral vehicles that are out there. We live in a world of what I think Frank Fukuyama called it, a world of multilateralism, in the sense that it's not just simply the formal international institution. The only point that I was going to make was that the ad hoc stuff is not enough. I guess I would say that we need both, when it looks at international institutions, we need both prix fixe and we need à la carte, right? We need à la charte, as it's also been called, the Charter of the United Nations, and the universal organizations, but then we also need these coalitions and some flexibility to them. Beyond the two causes of the current crisis of multilateralism that Tori and the ambassador mentioned, that is the U.S. abdication, and then, in a sense, the persistence of geopolitics. I just want to mention a couple of others. One of them is, I think that what we've seen, particularly in the wake of the global financial crisis, is an enormous disillusionment and it's the rising populism, and it's led to rising populism, enormous disillusionment with globalization and the sort of institutions that we actually have that appear to have some societal breakdowns associated with them and that have left people behind. So I think there's that in and of itself is making it much more difficult, and we see this, of course, in France, in your own country, of course, with the yellow vest phenomenon, where there's, on the one hand, the big multilateral agreement that's out there. The most important multilateral agreement of the 21st century is the Paris Climate Accord. On the other hand, people, again, as the saying goes, they want to get to the end of the month, and even while people are talking about the end of the world. The other issue that I would just want to point out, well, I could two more. One of them is that...
Well, actually, I want to stop you there because there's a lot in
sure.
that's a rich vein that we should tap.
We can get to the other stuff.
Yeah, and you know, what you're saying is very important. That is one of the critical reasons that multilateralism is under so much pressure today is because politicians are under tremendous pressure at home from people who are dealing with so many individual pressures, economic and social, that they're far less interested in helping other people elsewhere. And appeals to international cooperation do not resonate, and abstract arguments about how international cooperation may or will indeed end up benefiting us personally, you know, are too many steps removed from the way people think about it. I heard a few years ago the great psychologist Daniel Kahneman talking about climate change, and he was very pessimistic that anything is ever going to happen about climate change because he said the human brain is really not designed to deal with a problem like climate change. There are several problems with it. One is the scale is beyond our reckoning. Two is the time frame is too long. And third, the obvious ability of any individual act to impact what's going on is so unclear that it's just something that we human animals, our brains are not built to cope with. And there's something, you know, analogous happening with multilateral cooperation where, especially where the payoffs are indirect and not immediate, especially at moments like now when the pressures and the challenges that people face at home seem so pressing and so real. Now, this sentiment has been exaggerated and manipulated by unscrupulous populists in this country and elsewhere, but it's not just a subject for manipulation. It's not illegitimate. There's a real core there that everyone is paying attention to, and this is why it was the Obama administration was also very worried about this, or shared the concern, which is why it focused very hard on retrenchment, or at least limiting U.S. obligations abroad after the imperial overstretch of the Bush administration. And it's why even Hillary Clinton made this very striking comment in Europe a couple of weeks ago when she said that Europe needs to get a handle on its migration problem, or the populism problem there is going to get even worse. So the question is, given all of this intense pressure, which makes it harder than ever for internationally minded politicians to sell international politics at home, how can they, or how can governments reconcile these legitimate domestic concerns with the ongoing need for international cooperation? How can they persuade their very internally focused and sovereignty-minded publics that it's better to hang together than it is to hang separately? And that it's in their immediate interests to cooperate internationally, not just in their abstract long-term interests.
You know, when I was at the UN, the United Nations, when I was the French perm rep to the UN, one day there was the representative of a great democracy, which basically he had voted against human rights, a resolution on human rights, and defending a country which was not defendable for a democracy. And I asked him the question, I said, why did you do that? And his answer was a bit surprising. He said, you know, Gerard, we are not on the board. And I think it was an allusion about what you said, is our institutions are not reflecting the world of today. And that's also an important element. If you want to have Brazil or India, you know, as responsible as we hope, it's also, I think, necessary to give them the responsibilities to be on the board. And that the reform, and here we are talking the reform of the Security Council, reform also of the IMF. We have to bring this country to the board. France and UK, we have been advocating the reform of the Security Council for some time. The US, Russia, and China are much more reluctant for very different reasons, by the way. But again, we have to do it because Security Council is reflecting 1945. I think that's an important element. The second element where I would say, you're right, as George said, that you have a populist, the populist wave going in the direction of nationalism. But we don't have to forget that these populists, however noisy they are still a minority in our Western societies. And actually, you have all a part of our societies which are oriented towards internationalism. And you have also the fact that a lot of issues that we are facing, by definition, are international and are requesting a multilateral answer. So, because you are talking about climate change, but there is the cyber world, you know, really how to govern or how to manage the cyber world, which means cyber security, but which means also privacy. You know, it's very surprising that there is a rule of privacy in the European Union. It's not the same in the US. And if we don't have a common rule, it will be China, which will set the rules. You have the taxation of the high-tech companies. But you have also other issues like the future or the survival of the oceans. You know, so there are a lot of issues which by themselves demand a multilateral answer.
Right, but you're taking sort of a technocratic approach, and my question was as much about, fair enough, but my question was as much about politics, because that's inescapable when we talk about this.
I think the answer does go to your question, which is we have a failure of politics. We have a failure of leaders on both sides of the Atlantic to connect the daily life of citizens to the need for the democratic world to protect and preserve open markets, peace between great powers, to solve problems together, and a lack of confidence, I would argue, in our ability to do what we've always done, which is to innovate, reinvent, to be ahead of more closed societies in creating more prosperity, etc. We're not going to do better for our working men and women by trying to roll back the economic clock to the 1950s or reestablishing mercantile tariff systems. We're going to do better by working together to keep the system open, to innovate together, to solve problems like cyber predators, etc., together, and by pooling our innovative knowledge and getting ahead of these countries that are never going to do as well as we are if we release our energy, because they are too state controlled and because they control the minds and activities of their citizens. So we can compete. We need to be confident in that, but we also need politicians who go into communities and remind folks how many of their jobs depend on exports, how many of their jobs depend on the ability to trade freely, not just with Canada and Mexico, but with the whole world. And it's not true only on the US coast, it's true in the middle too. You know, Europe is the largest trading partner for at least 30 US individual states.
But do you think that politicians like Bill Clinton bear some of the blame for the current crisis by overselling the benefits of trade, or at least not being completely honest about what some of the downsides would be, and then not doing enough work to buffer the public from the inevitable disorienting shifts that occurred?
Yeah, let me, if I might pick that up. I think they bear a bit. I think that on the one hand, Bill Clinton was somebody who had enormous empathy and communicated that empathy and had sort of a populist or a popular common man's sort of ability to communicate with people. But I think that there was an element of sort of go-go globalization that sort of turbocharged globalization that took hold. And I think that capital has been freed, and capital has done very well. And I think that to some degree, I'm in favor of openness, but I feel like, at least in some cases, when it came to labor and employment and ensuring that there's a lot of talk about skills and retraining and trade adjustment assistance and things like that, but in many of our countries, frankly, and certainly in the United States, the sovereign space that countries retained, including for the United States, to actually pursue those policies despite promises on both Republican and Democratic sides were not necessarily fulfilled. Now, I think that their leadership is really the big issue, though, I think, because, leaderships can communicate some painful truths. One of them is that, yes, competition has taken away a bunch of jobs, but most of the jobs that have been lost in the United States in the manufacturing sector has largely been a result of automation. So what are we going to do as domestic policy to actually deal with those things? I think you need to show people that, as Tori said, that look how many exports from our county or from our state are actually going into the international trade system. We have a stake in this, and this is actually what the Mexican and Canadian governments did when NAFTA was being renegotiated. They started getting on the phone with the border state governors and the farm state governors and the manufacturing governors, and they tried to help push the administration forward on this. So you also have to show that these institutions are capable of reform. I think, for instance, you can sympathize with Donald Trump in saying the WTO is not doing anything to deal with China, but the reaction to that is not just have a bilateral, trade war with China. It's to get together with the Europeans and try to change some of the rules of the WTO so that you can actually deal with some of those things with respect to China that it's not doing.
I want to try and break down a couple of these answers a little bit more by asking, how much do you think the current crisis is a mechanical failure due to the fact that these aging structures are no longer responding very well to present threats, and how much of it is philosophical, which may represent a bigger problem, a reflection of the fact that there is no longer anything like a global consensus on the rules and norms that would need to underpin a functioning multilateral system?
Actually, the Americans don't like the idea of power politics, and so there is this idea about a so-called liberal order. Frankly, I've never seen any liberal order, really, because during the 70 years, there is a book, I've just finished a book about the killing fields of the Cold War, basically saying that millions of people died during the Cold War, because there were the wars of Korea, Vietnam, between India and Pakistan, the wars in Africa, 4 or 5 wars in the Middle East. Millions of people really died. Now, what we are seeing today, and what you call, liberal order was more or less the Western Europe and the US. It's a miracle, because usually Western Europe was very good at creating wars, and usually world wars, and really we avoided them.
Democratic Asia.
And exactly, yes. But you had a lot of wars also in Asia. And you had the killing fields of Indonesia in '65, millions of people. So what we have actually, for my interpretation, is what has changed is the balance of power. We are during the Cold War, you had 2 camps dominated, monitored by the US and USSR. After the collapse of the communist bloc, you had what the French called an hyperpower, the US. And it was the triumph of the West. And actually, in the last decade, you have emerging powers like China, Russia, but also India, who are simply they are telling us enough is enough. So you have a new balance of power, and this new balance of power is at the expense of the West. And we dominate also the institutions. Frankly, the UN is largely dominated by the West, not only the Security Council, but if you look at all the people in the bureaucracy, you see that there is an overwhelming majority of Western high officials. So we have a new world to manage where we are less powerful in relative terms than we were. So for me, that's the problem that we are facing.
Right, but again, the question is whether the problem is mechanical or philosophical, and so to apply it to what you've just said, is the solution required merely a manner of adjusting the current institutions to make more room for new entrants? Or is there a deeper problem? Are countries like China actually revisionist powers who don't just want a seat at the table, but they want to change the rules of the game? And if it's the latter, then how do we construct a new multilateral order along those lines that suits us as well as them?
Yeah, I think one of the responses may be that I think that actually, unfortunately, there are philosophical or normative differences, at least on some areas, that will make it difficult. I think that we probably are headed for a world that's a little shallower than we wanted in terms of the sort of normative agreement. That what's the tragedy right now is that the way the United States is behaving is that as if it doesn't even really believe in the concept of the West. I would have greater comfort if the United States were still in that position. I think that, you know, you sort of have to go sphere by sphere in terms of values. One of the disturbing ones, which actually could have better relations with the United States, with Russia and China, but it's disturbing to me, is the degree to which this administration has not defended at all what was a core component of the liberal order. You know, we think about, you know, sort of collective defense and open economies, but this silence, virtual silence on the issue of human rights or democracy, which maybe got a bad name during early administrations. That to me I find really disturbing, because I wouldn't want to have a world in which nobody cares about the domestic authority structures in other countries just so they could get along at the state level. But when you think about, I think there are major normative disagreements. I mean, when people talk about internet security or cybersecurity, there are even differences between the United States and Europe on a number of different things. Yeah, but the big differences are between, you know, sovereign control over the internet with, you know, constant surveillance and monitoring and violation of people's civil rights, as you have in China, versus at least in the Western conception of that. And, you know, there are disputes over issues of humanitarian intervention and what are the boundaries of sovereignty. There are a number of different areas where there are not just distributional questions like who gets more, how much weight at the World Bank do you get, or what's your share of trade, but really about fundamental philosophical questions about the way the world should be organized.
Yeah, I would foot stomp that even harder. I think we are in now, again, a major ideological challenge to openness and freedom from the autocratic powers. They are dissatisfied with the order and the institutions that we built. They have seats on the Security Council, but it doesn't change the fact that they are not behaving the way we expected, which was that if we invited them into all of these institutions, including the WTO, they would enjoy getting rich and living within this peaceful system that we were proposing. Instead, they are contesting to change the rules from within and to undercut not simply our leadership position, but also the system and public confidence in the system that undergirds it. So I think the question is, are we going to be unified in defending our citizens' right to live freely, individually in our nations, to represent themselves democratically, to innovate and prosper together, and to defend themselves together? Or are we going to fight among ourselves and take action against each other and allow the autocrats to either brute their way into greater leadership position or ooze their way, as another autocrat does, into a greater leadership position while we are squabbling? And that is the moment that we're in. And I also think that we did an insufficient job in coming out of the financial crisis and learning those lessons together, whether it was within the EU itself, whether it was transatlantically, in terms of reviving a new economy for our citizens in the wake of that.
So to follow up on that by trying to make things still more concrete, we've done a really good job of laying out the current threats and the looming dangers. But I'm curious, are we already suffering from the breakdown in multilateralism? Are there costs that we are already paying in security or in economics? Or are these hypothetical, even if probable, problems that loom in the near future? Are we already paying the price, living with the consequences of a breakdown in multilateralism? Can you think of examples? Or is it things, is more a matter of things that we fear will come if we continue down this path?
I mean, I would argue that we are paying, the United States is paying a price for deciding to take on China's trade illiberalism all by ourselves, rather than accepting the European and North Asian offer to get into this business together, we're having to exact a greater price on China by ourselves than we would have been if we had decided what the costs were going to be multilaterally. I would argue that Russia's latest adventurism in the Sea of Azov and trying to get by sea in Ukraine what they couldn't get by land and continuing to accrete into their neighbors' territory is a direct result of us being asleep at the switch and squabbling with each other rather than paying attention to shoring up the free world. Those are just two examples. Obviously on climate change, we're all hoping we can secure the progress and keep moving, but it's not necessarily clear.
Stuart, you follow this stuff closely. Do you see other warning signs that it's already happening?
I was thinking of the climate change aspect of things. You know, the fact that the United States not only has said that it's going to pull out doesn't happen until right after the next president is whoever that may be is elected. But that has actually slowed momentum. That promise to pull out of Paris, and as you saw in the recent COP in Poland, you saw the United States get together with a number of other fossil fuel exporting countries to basically try to go against this trend and not to welcome, for instance, a very devastating report by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change about the dire straits that we're in. And that slows down not only what governments are doing, but it also takes away market signals that could be really helpful to the private sector. It makes them hedge a little bit. I do think also the United States, just in terms of hedging, the United States has found that it's weakening solidarity amongst a number of its close allies. The European steps towards maybe moving towards a more integrated defense entity. In some ways, that's a good thing, right? Taking more responsibility for one's strategic and military sort of self-reliance, but there are some indications that there's questions about how reliable some of the commitments that the United States has made. In South Korea, there's a lot of trepidation about the degree to which the United States is reliable, and an effort to try to make sure that if war comes to the Korean Peninsula, that troops from the Republic of South Korea are actually under ROK control and no longer under U.S. control in military. It's just one indication, and I think there are others of other countries beginning to hedge against the unreliability of the United States.
So I want to ask you all in the audience to start thinking about your questions. I have one more that I'm going to ask myself, and then I'm going to turn things over to you. I'd like you all to imagine for a second that the international system was still functioning smoothly, and that there still was a general agreement among the major powers about the underlying norms. Even under those circumstances, even in that hypothetical, would the international system, the multilateral system such as it is, be able to deal adequately with the major global threats that we face today, like climate change, like cyber, like inequality? Or is the real problem with the international system not just that because it's 70 years old, it no longer reflects the power map of the world, but is it also because it was designed at a time when those three threats that I just enumerated, among many others, weren't in anyone's imagining? And so is the problem that our tools are not well suited to the problems that we have to use them for today?
Actually, what was done for the COP21 is an example that we can improvise, we can be inventive, and we can bring to the table all the stakeholders and to reach an agreement. And so far, only the United States has left the room. China and India especially have been very keen on repeating that they want to stick to the agreement. And when President Macron created this Peace Forum, because the idea is to have the Peace Forum every year, in a sense, it's what he wants to do is it's a call for creativity. Obviously, the international system, but also in domestic terms, the representative institutions in the countries and the international systems are challenged. They are challenged by the new balance of power. They are challenged by the populism challenged by also the claim, really the fact that our citizens with social media have new demands which are legitimate. So it's also, let's trust our societies to invent new mechanisms to try to respond to these challenges. So again, of course, the institutions are important, and we should reform them. We should enlarge the Security Council in terms of permanent members, but we have also to really try to look at other ways of working together. The coalitions of willing that Toria was referring to, but also new systems like the COP21 was, in a sense, an example of what we can do.
That's the new climate change agreement he's referring to.
I think that, just to pick up on what the ambassador was saying, there are, fortunately, although I do think ultimately things need to be sort of formalized within sort of international law for sort of staying power and legitimacy and burden sharing over the long term. I do think that there's that the COP21 experience was a good example of these workarounds, if you will. You can't get a formal treaty, or you can't get a formal multilateral treaty like you would have in the past, so you use individual, nationally determined contributions, and then everybody comes to the table with what they've got. And not only that, it's multi-stakeholder and it's multi-level, so you have states and localities and coalitions of mayors making and corporations making their own commitments. I think that's very important. That said, you ask, well, is it enough, even if the U.S. were still in? The difficulty is that the estimate is that only 1/3 of the mitigation in terms of greenhouse gases that we need, that the lowering of those emissions, only 1/3 will actually be accomplished during the time frame that we need to get to. So even with the ratcheting up of commitments that's supposed to happen over the long term, it's going to be really, really hard to get there. The other thing I would say is that I think some of the difficulty we're running into is that the problems, particularly those that are driven by technology, are happening so incredibly quickly. We have no idea what artificial intelligence and machine learning and automation are actually going to do to global conflict and the balance of power amongst countries. And it's coming down the pike, much less what it's going to do for employment, right? And it's coming down the pike so fast that our lumbering institutions, by and large, have a very difficult time dealing with this. The same thing could be said for the genomics revolution, for the nanotechnology, many other frontier issues in technology.
Thank you. You want to say something?
I just want to say, I think one of the problems of the current debate, and this was reflected, I think, in the Pompeo speech in Brussels, is this sort of false choice between strong state sovereignty and multilateral approaches. Any multilateral approaches I've ever seen succeed are a direct result of strong sovereign states choosing to act at home and then choosing to act collectively with others. You don't wake up and say, hey, UN, do some damn thing. It's the states of the UN that make these choices. So I think it really comes down to national will in the first instance, and then national will to act together. And that is what is fraying. Even in an EU context, you've pooled a lot of sovereignty, but you made national choices to do that, and national choices to deepen and broaden it.
I think that's really, I want to emphasize this point. When people say the UN, no, the UN doesn't exist. If the member states of the UN have decided or have not decided, and the EU, it's really the populists in Europe have chosen Brussels as their whipping boy. Actually, no, Brussels doesn't decide. It's the member states which decide.